va intervenir en anglais, situé au milieu des rangées, un tas de politique copié, donc avec la traduction de son intervention, intitulée Féministes de tous les pays, qui lave vos chaussettes.
Well, first of all, I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very important conference. I think they must be very proud. It's been obviously a huge success, so it's been great. And I'd also like to thank the translator of my text, Mathieu Bonson, who translated the text very quickly and very well, I have to say, and I really apologize for not being able to deliver this paper in French. But it's good. It's really good that you have the translation. My aim in this presentation is to analyze some of the implications of the current participation of many feminists in the widespread stigmatization of migrants in general and Muslim migrants in particular in the name of gender equality. To describe this phenomenon, this general phenomenon, I use the term femonationalism. So I will briefly explain what I mean by this term before I go to the core of my presentation. Now, I call femonationalism the ideological and discursive formation that brings together the heterogeneous anti-immigration and anti-Islam concerns of nationalist parties, some feminists, and neoliberal governments under the idea of gender equality. As a discourse, femonationalism has been constituted and nourished through the practice and production of meanings, symbols, images, and discursive regularities into what we can say is senso comune in Gramsci's word. A word that is difficult to translate in English. We might translate it as something like common knowledge. And just to give you an example, just to think of how the idea that Islam in particular oppresses women has become a very widespread common knowledge, particularly since 9/11 onwards. But as an ideological formation, femonationalism needs also to be understood in its concrete materiality, namely in the forms in which the widespread deployment of the femonationalist trope of this idea of gender equality, particularly against Muslim migrants, by a number of different political subjects, and its constitution as a senso comune, or common knowledge, as I said. So I'm interested in how this ideology might be linked to broadly conceived material and class interests, as well as to what we can say, in a way, recalling Althusser, is the need for the reproductions of the conditions, I would say, of social reproduction. And I will explain in this paper what I mean by this. Now, femonationalism has been profoundly divisive for feminism. The migrant, specifically Muslim woman question in the last years has indeed been the site of lively debates engaging feminist intellectuals, politicians and activists across Europe and the Western world. On the one hand, well-known feminists such as Elisabeth Badinter in this country, Ida Magni in Italy, and Siska Dijsselhuis in the Netherlands have publicly endorsed the idea that Muslim practices, such as the headscarf, should be banned as symbols of women's oppression. On the opposite side, we have feminists in these same countries, and here I'm thinking of figures such as Christine Delphi, Anna Maria Rivera, and Anja Meulenfeld, among others, who have criticized such a characterization of Islam not only as an overgeneralization, but as also helping to foment growing anti-immigration sentiments. Now, I should like to say at the outset that my position is close to that of this second group. Feminist critical voices have already proposed thoughtful interpretations of this phenomenon, particularly in France. For instance, according to Félix Bourgeot and Stella Mayani-Belkacem, authors of a compelling critique that places French feminism's white supremacy in historical perspective, the convergence between feminism and contemporary Islamophobia is a strategic one. Similarly, Christine Delphi describes the convergence between feminists in favor of the anti-veil law and French racist politics as a sacrificial one. She doesn't use this term. This is the way I am characterizing her position. Basically, she says, by contrasting anti-sexism and anti-racism and positioning them as struggles that cannot be reconciled, Delphi argues certain feminists have chosen the former at the expenses of the latter. Finally, the sociologist Sylvie Tissot argues for a conjunctural convergence between what she calls state feminism and the racist system. As she puts it, feminism has become one of the metaphors for racism. In this presentation, I seek to explore an hypothesis that builds upon these interpretations in order to extend them. In particular, I propose to shed further light on a specific point of convergence between state feminism and the anti-immigration, anti-Islam politics by focusing on a specific phenomenon which has been widely overlooked. I refer to the calls for the promotion of migrant women's employment, which are an integral part of the civic integration policies across Europe. These calls, as I will illustrate in detail throughout this paper, have been implemented both by state feminists and through the mobilization of state feminism. It is an important distinction, because state feminism, on the one hand, identifies what scholars like Cantola and other scholars classically identify as the women's equality state agencies, and we can think about, for instance, the ministries for equal opportunities of equality between women and men in different countries. This is an example of state feminism, but also we should think of state feminism, and this is what Sylvie Tissot does in her paper, as that type of mainstream feminism that the state mobilizes and instrumentalizes against migrant Muslim communities in particular. In the growing literature on the gender dimensions of civic integration policies across Europe, for those who are not familiar with this term, the civic integration policies are the policies that require migrants to demonstrate the knowledge of the language, the history, and the values of the host country in order to be granted a visa. So in the growing literature on the gender dimensions of these policies, the fact that they interpellate migrant women as wage workers has been, with very few exceptions, entirely overlooked. Discussions have been dominated instead by the cultural aspects of these requirements. For instance, at a certain point, it became particularly well-known examples of the image of the Dutch topless women sunbathing, integration materials in the Netherlands. So the cultural aspects, in particular, the differences between especially Muslim communities and the European countries in terms of culture has been the aspect on which much focus, there has been most focus. But yet the economic aspects are very important. The economic integration of migrant women, in fact, has been one of the primary goals of the European Guidelines on Civic Integration. In the 2011 agenda of the European Commission, which is the document that summarizes the philosophy of the whole civic integration project in Europe, gender equality is mentioned almost exclusively in relation to employment. The privileging of work as the main area of intervention for promoting equality between men and women at the European level stems from the strict linkage between recent integration migration policies and the so-called Europe 2020 strategy, which is the document basically ratifying workfare across EU countries. The ideological infrastructure informing the workfare measures attached to civic integration policies is particularly gendered. The need to promote migrant women's employment, which appears as a priority in both workfare and integration directives, in fact is based not so much on the assumption that women are parasitic on the system, which is something consistently claimed in the case of migrant men, particularly in the public debates in the national media. Rather, the emphasis on migrant women's integration in the labour market is recast as an opportunity for them to become emancipated. A profusion of statistical data across national studies and policy documents across different European countries have been increasingly deployed in the last years, highlighting migrant women's lower employment and activity rates when compared with migrant men's. More or less explicitly, the lower rates of participation of migrant women in the workforce are attributed to their backward cultural backgrounds, particularly when in the case of Muslim women, which are deemed responsible for keeping these women in a state of subjection and economic dependence, and thus for keeping them out of the paid labor force. In the case of non-Western women who arrive in Europe mostly as family members, the emphasis upon work as an instantiation of integration is consequently not only informed by the workforce strategy of the EU, but also originates in the particular interpretation of gender equality that has been put forward by state feminism, as I defined it above. For European state feminists, the promotion of gender equality policies in recent years arguably has been informed by the general idea that work is that which sets women free. Accordingly, work outside the household has been recast as the litmus test for gender equality. Albeit not explicitly presented as workfare, but rather as an instance of gender justice for women's economic independence, state feminism's emphasis upon the need to mobilize the female labor force, including its migrant component, in order to achieve the goals set by the Europe 2020 strategy, is therefore one of the major points at which the somehow paradoxical convergence with neoliberal racist political agendas is taking place. But my question is, what are the concrete consequences of this paradox and this convergence on the lives of migrant women at national level? The case of France is particularly emblematic. I should have said at the outset, my work focuses in particular on 3 European countries, Italy, the Netherlands, but also France. So I will give you some examples from France in this case. Since 2009, the law on migrants' integration has established a professional portfolio as an obligatory requirement for all signatories of the contract of reception and integration. The implementation of the obligatory professional portfolio was thought as an instrument to tackle the disadvantaged position of the migrant population in the labor market, particularly its female component. So while being presented as a way to assess the skills and attitudes of incoming migrants in order to help them to find the right match, the professional portfolio has instead become an instrument to control the encounter between supply and demand, with an eye mostly at the latter. So all in all, the encouragement of women to be active in the labor market and the identification of mechanisms like this professional portfolio purportedly established to help them overcome the obstacles they find have de facto function to direct them towards those jobs native-born women and men, for different reasons, do not want to take: housekeeping, cleaning, babysitting, nursing, and caring. Despite their higher level of education and previous work experience, migrant women in France, but not only in France, also in other European countries, are thus systematically directed towards the social reproductive sector. In this scenario, French state feminists' prominent role in the European landscape in the stigmatization of non-Western, especially Muslim cultures, and religious practices as the site of all misogyny and obstacles to integration, as well as in the support of integration policies for migrant women, emerges as rather contradictory. Rather than empowering migrant women, the institutional discourse and the practice of the French Intégration républicaine that many feminists have enthusiastically embraced thus far seems to go in the direction of strengthening the very forms of gender discrimination that French state feminism has been vocal in denouncing. The implementation of civic integration policies that seek to activate migrant women in the labor market, in fact, further exacerbates the construction of care and domestic work as a highly feminized and racialized labor market. By responding to the workfare calls of the civic integration policies and supporting the implementation of programs that segregate female migrant workers in the care, cleaning, and domestic sector, state feminism has de facto converged with the neoliberal workfare ideology in perpetuating societal divisions along the fault lines of gender, race, and class. It is worth noting that the recasting of migrant women's work as an opportunity for them to gain economic independence and emancipation under the stereotypical assumption that they are dependent and backward is most often proposed in the name of women's emancipation through participation in production. The question then remains, why is this same notion of women's emancipation through participation in production used to push migrant women into social reproduction? Now, the demand for women's economic independence and for their equal access to the labor force has indeed been one of the most important but also controversial ones of the feminist movement from the outset. It was a divisive demand until the beginning of the 20th century because it was put forward by middle-class women who were excluded from production, whereas peasant and working-class women had already been incorporated into the labor force for a long time. But this same demand was arguably a unifying one, particularly under Fordism, because within Fordism and with the development of the breadwinner model, both middle-class and working-class women were pushed out of production into social reproduction. The demand for economic independence and the denunciation of the segregation of women into the devalued private sphere of social reproduction in the Fordist times, therefore, unified the different currents of the feminist movement. Despite the fact that they continued, of course, to be divided on other issues and to have different takes on the meaning of economic independence itself, with the advent of so-called post-Fordism and neoliberalism since the late 1970s and 1980s, women's incorporation into paid work has become a reality. The demand for women's economic independence, thus, not only has become a less urgent one in mainstream feminist agendas, but I argue, when mobilized, it has become again a divisive demand, albeit not only along the class, but also along the racial lines. It is therefore in the context of so-called post-Fordism and neoliberalism, with women's rates of activity on the rise, that we can understand why state feminism in particular pushes migrant women into work in the name of a classically Fordist demand. It is here that the notion of different temporalities might come of help to understand the contradictions of state feminism in particular. More specifically, I will resort to the notions of temporal distancing and the temporal disjunction to clarify this argument. I'm going to my conclusions. I contend that with its call for Muslim migrant women to enter the labor force to become economically independent, namely to follow the path Western feminists claim to have traveled in their own narrative of emancipation, state feminism treats these women, these migrant women, like developmentalists and modernization theorists treated underdeveloped nations. They are always one or more steps behind, and therefore they have to catch up. By calling Muslim migrant women to work in order to become economically independent, state feminism deploys what Johannes Fabian called temporal distancing. That is, they assume a distance, or they assume that there is a distance between Western and non-Western women, not only in space, in terms of geopolitical and social background, or in terms of social class, but also in time, in terms of ascribing non-Western migrant women's social experience to a temporality which constituted the past for Western European women. The temporalization of the relationship between Western and non-Western women serves above all to support the idea that Western and non-Western women's histories have been historically autonomous and independent one from the other. As in the case of the non-Western nations, the conditions of relative poverty and exploitation in which migrant women find themselves in Western Europe while migrants are presented as an instance of temporal distance and as the result of their endogenous cultural deficiency. Moreover, by mobilizing the campaign for economic independence, in particular for migrant women, state feminism is caught into what I would call a temporal disjunction. Such a temporal disjunction, that is, the mobilization of a feminist demand which was prominent in the past of the feminist movement more than it is now. So this temporal disjunction is incomprehensible without taking into account the racialization of the alleged beneficiary of such a demand. Indeed, such a temporal disjunction is predicated upon the temporal distancing between Western and non-Western women, which is inscribed in the teleological narrative of emancipation through productive work, developed by important sections of the feminist movements, particularly after Fordism. It is for this set of reasons that I am in disagreement with an important recent intervention, which is that of Nancy Fraser. Unlike Fraser, who talks of an elective affinity between a second wave of feminism and neoliberalism from the outset, so much that feminism, according to Fraser, might have provided neoliberalism with some of its tools for reconfiguring class exploitation and the dismantling of the welfare state, albeit unwittingly. I would argue instead that second wave feminist demand for women's integration into the workforce, as I emphasized, must be understood in the historical context in which they were elaborated, a context in which the majority of women, both working and middle class, did not work outside the household because their dependence upon the male breadwinner's wage was inscribed in the Fordist model. Today's state feminist reiteration of the same set of demands in the case of migrant women and in a context in which neoliberal workfare politics makes those demands entirely compatible with a racist and gender-biased political agenda is thus, in my view, a pointing case not of temporal continuity, as Fraser's train of thought might lead us to think, but a case of temporal disjunction. To be sure, it is a temporal disjunction grounded in a fundamentally and certainly not new Eurocentric perspective, one which assumes migrant women are fundamentally backward and victimized objects, whose hope for emancipation is taken by state feminists to lie in their commitment to catch up with their older Western sisters. But the conditions of reproduction, and above all the implications of such a Eurocentric, when not overly racist, feminist position need to be analyzed for their intersectional character and for the deep contradictions they create for feminism altogether.
Ouais, mais ça s'est super bien passé. On se connaissait quasiment pas, on a fait 10 ans, on était tous du même laboratoire de Nanterre. Je connaissais quasiment pas.
Paul Gilbert, qui est un membre du comité d'organisation et modérateur. Voilà.
c'est pas dans les sciences sociales, il faut s'en dire quelque chose. Et là que ça se passe. C'est un peu dramatique hein, quand on y pense. Enfin, voilà.
Il y a un film politique qui était marqué, ça n'a jamais coûté cher.
Oui. Oui, c'est vrai. Non, tout ce qui se fait d'intéressant, c'est vraiment en philo.
Ouais, ok. Moi je vais rester sur le côté, je peux faire aussi.
Ah oui. Oui.